Okay, well, let's get started. So this being a prefix of CAS is more of a case study. And Stephen and I are both from consulting here in North America, and so we wanted to present some of the things that we've learned as far as some best practices, hopefully some things to make your life a lot easier in using SUSE Manager and SALT and some of those things. So we are going to talk about SUSE Manager, but not just some of the typical things. A lot of it's going to be more strategic, and some of the things may be less familiar, maybe at the command line. Do you guys use the command line for SUSE Manager? The space command? You ever use that? Okay. Do you use space command?
I'm not using SUSE Manager much myself.
Oh, okay.
My colleagues do, but I want to know more about it so I can jump in there.
Okay. And also, we'll talk a little bit about SALT. Now, with SUSE Manager, we want to talk about, come on in, patching lifecycle management, configuration management, and then also using some of the APIs. And there's a lot we could talk about, but these are some of the things that we wanted to focus on. As well as with SALT, we wanted to talk about what are some of the features that we can utilize to do some data center automation, and what are some of the things we would get from the command line versus using the UI, and then also using the REST API into SALT. So let's talk about SUSE Manager and the patching lifecycle. Now, when we talk about patching lifecycle management, probably what we need to first discuss is, before even what patching lifecycle management is, what is the need or the problem we're trying to solve? And if you have SUSE Manager, you know that every night it goes out to SUSE's website, right, updates.suse.com, and it grabs updates, and it pulls them down and mirrors them into your SUSE Manager. And that's nice because you're always getting updates. However, that's a problem because you're always getting updates, right? And so you want to have your environment more stable. And so we want, when we talk about a life cycle of how you're going to manage your patches, that's what we're talking about with this patching lifecycle management, that we want to be able to take our patches and take a snapshot and say, these are patches for dev. When we're ready, we'll promote them into dev. Then we'll do our testing, everything works well, then we'll promote them into maybe a staging or a test environment, and then from there we can promote them into prod. And so that now makes things a lot more stable. Now, this can become very critical with even just a few systems. I've been on some engagements where, when we talk about SAP implementations, where they might only have 6 SAP systems, but they purchase SUSE Manager just to manage the patches, because if one bad patch hits one of those SAP servers, their business is going to be down. And so they want to be able to control that and run that through different life cycles. And so there's 2 main strategies that we have for patching lifecycle management. And one is this consolidated organizational-based channel. And if you look at our website under best practices, there's a document called Advanced Patching Lifecycle Management. Has anyone read that? The Advanced Patching Lifecycle? Okay. And so we're going to talk about that model, but there's also another strategy that we use for patching lifecycle management. So this is roughly what's described in that document. And when we look at our patches here, SUSE Manager is mirroring that from SUSE, and we get a distribution, right? That's where we typically will see like SLES 12 SP4, for example, in there, or SLES 15. We could have systems directly subscribe to this, and that's what this area is right here. But we don't want to do that because that's the one that's getting updated every night, and we don't want that to become unstable. Let me grab your pointer. Here. Oh, thanks. Where's your laser?
You can leave that.
What?
Don't worry about that.
Okay. Where's the laser button? Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so there's our distribution, and the strategy is that we're going to create an organizational base channel. So if your company was ABC Corp, we'd probably call this ABC, and then it'd be ABC-/12SP4, for example. And so we would clone everything in there. However, this updates, we're going to have OS updates, and by default, we're going to have Manager Tools updates. And Manager Tools updates is basically the SALT minion. We still don't want systems to subscribe to those channels. So we're going to have them subscribe to the OS pool, the Manager Tools pool. We might even have an organizational apps, right? For internal apps, we would have in a repository. So everyone would subscribe to those. However, this is where the life cycle starts, is we now have, we would have a dev OS updates, and we would have a test OS updates and a prod. Same thing with tools, we'd have updates there. So if a system was to be in the dev environment, here we can look at the different columns. So if it's dev, it's going to have those base channels, the organization, but it will subscribe to those channels, just the update channels. And the reason why is because when those systems get their updates, we want to control when they do get their updates, right? So dev will only be updated when we promote into dev. Any thoughts or comments about that? Okay. It is a little more of administrative overhead to do it this way, but it does provide a much more stability by doing a life cycle of your channels here. Likewise, we can archive any one of those, and so we would before, and typically another strategy to think about is when do you want to archive? If you read the patching lifecycle document, it has a little different strategy than what's here. It has this organizational base channel, but it says we're going to archive in the beginning. Okay. The other option is not to always promote into there, but then archive before you update prod. And that really just comes down to a strategy. Do you want to archive all of your patches before you update prod? And that would be taking a strategy of saying prod's golden, so I only archive before I change prod. And that way, if maybe I have to promote 50 times from my base channel into this dev and test environment, I don't want to have to keep creating archives. So I can just update that and merge that in there, okay? Or some people do like to take the archive in the beginning and then build off of that. So either way, it kind of just depends on a preference of when you're going to take your archive. And so as we use our activation keys and we bring systems in, this is how we would map them to their different channels using this model. Now, here's the distributed organizational base. And when we do a distributed organizational base, now what we're saying is we're going to take that /12SP4, for example, and we will clone that. And so now we have an organizational. So this would be our ABC. From here, rather than having one great big channel set, we're going to take just this and clone this channel set into dev. And then we're going to clone this one into test and clone that whole set into prod. Okay? And so what do you think of these strategies? Any comments? Do you like one better than the other? Does one look simpler? Yeah, they're not simple. Actually, that's true. They're not simple. They both require some work, but it does give you some stability.
Well, how about this? So there's only a couple people in the room, but who's accidentally had like a image build or something like that break because of an updated, say, Apache version or SSL version? Anyone? Yeah. And so this gives you really the ability to automate and control that. I can test my image build in Jenkins. Because essentially, really what we're working with here is a web server with a bunch of subdirectories and various package versions and some metadata, right? So being able to get into that loop and basically control that, test it before you advance or promote a particular distribution is critical. And then you don't have stuff breaking because of what's been done upstream in some package management system, a new build. Instead, you have the ability to control very granularly what builds and how it succeeds. And if something does break, then you can actually go back to your developers, and it's not upstream Canonical, upstream SUSE or Tumbleweed or something like that. Now you actually have control over that process.
And each one of these, thank you, and each one of these is basically a snapshot in time. So you might promote into dev 50 times, troubleshooting different breaks, but once you get it right, then you can promote it into test, right? And then hopefully everything goes well in test, and then you promote it into prod, for example. So why do we take and talk about all this? Well, so usually it does require a little bit of scripting to make this a little more manageable, but this provides a lot of stability so that you don't have those sleepless nights and get calls of systems getting updated and broken by getting packages that would break them. Okay. So patch management and setting up a life cycle. One last thing I want to say before we do that is on the SUSE Manager roadmap. And if you look at, there is a session, it's one of the futures session on SUSE Manager, where the product manager, Joe Warner, is going to talk about the roadmap and the features. This all has to be done at the command line pretty much today. And so when SUSE Consulting comes in, that's typically what we're doing, is we'll kind of script this so that it's a little easier. However, in SUSE Manager 4.0, I believe it's 4.0, this will be part of the product. And it will be following this model, okay? So it won't be using this model, it'll be using more of this model where channel sets and patches will be promoted into each one of these different environments. All right, so let's talk about configuration management. So I know Craig's using a little bit of Salt today, a little bit. Anyone, are you guys using Salt or another configuration management tool today? Okay.
So how many systems are you guys managing then?
Well, in our case, it's just a few, right? We're just starting to.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and so getting into configuration management, right? The more the systems you get, the more it becomes needful, right? So you're not wasting time trying to make sure all your systems are configured the same. So within SUSE Manager, it incorporates, since it's using Salt, you can now implement states, Salt states within the interface. Now a Salt state is basically just a YAML file that describes the state you want that system in. So you might write a state for Apache and say, I want the Apache 2 package installed. I want this comp file laid down, and I want the service in a running state. Okay? It could be that simple. That's the state. And if you apply that state, it will put the system into that state. This is implemented in SUSE Manager through state channels. So the traditional method that was built into SUSE Manager were configuration channels. We can now, when it's a Salt system, we would implement it as a state channel. So we want to talk about state channels. We want to talk about forms and formulas and what we can do with those. And also leveraging configuration scope on there, and I'll talk about what that means. So if you are ever faced with the decision of using the traditional client or the Salt minion, you want to use the Salt minion, okay? That's the direction that the product's going, as well as just the feature set is much greater. So when we use Salt, we can manage those states within the UI, and we can also do our configuration management and have version control on there. Okay, so our states can actually have different versions, and so we can look and see how a state has changed over time. Let me just show you this quickly. So if I go into SUSE Manager, I go down to configuration, and I go to configuration channels. So here are the configuration channels, okay? And so you'll see on here that when we look at this, so let's take a look, for example, at my NTP, okay? And if we look at this NTP, we see that here's the actual state file in there, okay? And so there's the contents of my state. So in this case, I'm managing my NTP configuration. So it's a simple salt state, right? I've got an NTP conf file that's being managed. It's going to be pushed down. I've got the service I want in a running state. And then you notice the NTP package installed. Now, if I come in and say compare file, okay, if I had multiple revisions, then I would actually see within there all the different ways I've edited this state. So you could actually go and revert to a version of that state. Maybe someone edited it and it broke something. So there are some advantages of using the interface within there. And that's what we're talking about is if you're familiar with salt states, typically in your state tree you would create a folder called NTP, for example, and then you'd put your init SLS in there, and then you'd put maybe your NTP conf, right, and all those things you do. When you do a state and it says, hey, what do you want this state to be? And in this case I called it NTP Suma. It's basically creating a directory and putting that init in that directory for me. Okay, that's what the state channel is it's basically a container or a directory, and it has the files in there. And then if I was going to add like an additional configuration file, I could upload my NTP conf, and then now that would be part of this state that would get deployed. Now, before we talk about implementing these and what that means, I do want to take a moment and talk about forms and formulas, because this is very powerful when we talk about configuration management. When I talk about pillars, who in here understands what a salt pillar is? Okay, all right. So let's take a moment and talk about pillar. So salt uses a lot of terms like grains of salt, right? Pillars of salt, all these puns, right? So pillars of salt are really just configuration items, such as maybe for NTP, I might create a pillar called NTP server, and I put the IP address that I want all my systems to point to for NTP. Okay, that could be a pillar. It just means it's a piece of data that's centrally managed on my SUSE Manager or Salt Master that I'm going to push or assign to my systems. Okay, now that's typically in YAML type format. So the default location would be SRV pillar. Okay, and so for example, there's a dev, and so here I've got, what this is really saying is that I'm creating a dictionary structure, right? If you're familiar with YAML or JSON, it's basically a dictionary. So I have a pillar called NTP that has a key in it called NTP server, and in this case it says pool NTP. If I take a look at my prod NTP, okay, and now it's got, it actually has the same one, doesn't it? Yeah, so I could have different ones in there, right? Now, I can either manage these flat files, right? But one of the issues I might have is that I might have a typo, right? If you've used YAML before, it doesn't take long to realize that you can't use tabs, right? The first time you put a tab in there and it goes, hey, I can't render your YAML file, right? It has to be spaces. Those kinds of things can be error prone. So what we have in SUSE Manager is you can create your own interface to manage that data. So let's take a look at some of those. What I'm going to do is, let me just pick a system here. Let's do like server 1. Okay, I'm going to come back to states because that's what we were just talking about, but we're going to talk about these forms and formulas for a minute, okay? So I've actually got quite a few different forms in here, okay? And the nice thing about this is very simple. So ironically, I said we're kind of avoiding YAML, but we actually have to write some YAML to create this interface. So this interface is some simple YAML and it builds it. But you can categorize it, right? So you can define any of these categories. These are just the ones that I've categorized. So here's one for like SAP. to create my SAP SID users. Okay, and so when I check the box and I hit save, a new tab automatically shows up. Okay, so through some simple YAML, here is the form that I've defined. Okay, so I've said that I'm going to create these users, and then notice I've got this user, I've got this other user on here, and then I hit save. Okay, I don't want that. So what did that do? Well, let's look at the pillar data. If I come in and I say salt, and let's do server 1, I believe it was. Actually, let's just try it. Okay, this structure right here got added to the pillar data. Okay, so these are the 2 SAP users I had defined on that form, and it wrote that pillar dictionary, if you will, for me. Okay, so I don't have to worry about typos or anything. In fact, I can even have, if we add another SAP, somebody just has to come in here, and they could now say SID3, whatever. I can specify the UID. If I leave it blank, it will do the next one. There's some different flags on here as far as whether I want it to generate a password, or I've set a default in here to the super secret SUSE password. Some of this, you do need to know a little bit about SALT in the background. For the requirements that I was working with the customer on this one, for example, SALT has an option of a flag of enforced password, and what that does is it says, okay, I'm going to set the password to SUSE the first time I provision this user, but it might change later on. And so if I reapply this state, I don't want it to set it back to SUSE because somebody's changed it. So if I uncheck enforce, then it will leave the password if it's already set. Okay? And then if I need to hash the password, or if I'm actually going to paste in a hashed password. So that's going to hash it for me. And then, of course, the shell. And these are all, this form probably took me maybe 15 minutes to create on here. Okay? And this is in the SUSE Manager documentation. So now I hit save. And let's come in here. I might need a refresh pillar. So let's just see if it did. Nope, it added it for me. So there's my SID3 user. Okay. So now, on the SALT state side of things, I just have a for loop that says for each user in SAP users of this key of my pillar data, for each one of those users in there, create them on that, okay? And that's a very simple state. In fact, we won't go into the details, but I just want you to see how easy that is. Okay, so this one is a little bit more than just YAML. This has a little bit of Jinja so that we can make it dynamic. And if you're not familiar with Jinja, the analogy I always use is HTML, for example, on a web page is static, right? It's a structured language, but we usually add JavaScript that determines based on certain values, it might rewrite the YAML, right? And so that's the same thing with SALT, is we have YAML, but Jinja can dynamically write that. So that's how I've got my for loop. And so it's just user.present, and it goes through each one of those pillar SAP users and does a user.present and makes that user present on that system. Okay? And here's an example that when you download the deck, that you'll be able to see. This is one for DHCP, and this one does ship with SUSE Manager as well. So you fill out this form, hit save, if you've whatever server you've assigned this to, it will now deploy a DHCP server to that system based on those configuration parameters. Okay, so how are we going to utilize this to optimize its implementation? Well, for states, we can assign states at the organization level. Every SUSE Manager has one organization at least when you set it up, whether you know it or not. We could override that and assign it to a specific system group of systems, okay? Or we can even override that at individuals. So if we didn't override it, everyone would get that version of that state at the organization level, or it would get it, you know, it would override it as needed. Same thing with the forms and formulas. Is this same formula, let's go back because that's probably a little more visual and easier to understand. So in this simple example, what I showed you before is I had assigned it to server 1. If I go to server 2 and go to formulas, okay, SAP is not selected there, right? So I'm going to select it, hit save. Now I have my SAP users, and now I would fill in this form for the SAP SID users for these systems, okay? So if you have like, you know, typically people, especially with SAP, they cluster it. So I might have a group for maybe each cluster that's going to have the same SID users. When a system comes in, making a member of that group, it now inherits this information that was filled in this form. And that's different than another system group that would have different values on here. At the end of the day, it's going to end up as specific pillar information for each one of those systems. Yeah?
Do you have like a library of, let's say, most common forms, for example, SAP or whatever?
So there are some that are starting to ship with SUSE Manager that just come with it, like the DHCP, the DNS, locale. I think there's some Pixie stuff, some TFTP servers. So we're starting to, where maybe SUSE hasn't shipped it yet, you can go out to SaltStack's GitHub, and there's a formula catalog. Now you might have to put together the form to utilize that, and I've done that on a couple of these, but you can at least have a place to start by doing that. So, in fact, that's usually where I go, especially if it's an app I'm not familiar with. So like if someone says, hey, I go into engagement, they're like, we want you to help us use Salt to deploy CouchDB. Okay, well, I'm not that familiar with CouchDB, but there's a CouchDB formula already written in SaltStack's Hub, so I'll download that, and that's where I'm going to start on there. And each one of these, when you look at those formulas, whether they're from SUSE or SaltStack's GitHub, will have what's called a pillar.example, and it will show you an example of the pillar structure that formula is going to create. And that's usually a good place to kind of get an idea of what it's going to do. Any other questions? Thanks, by the way. Okay. So we're going to kind of leave those kind of Salt integration pieces of SUSE Manager for a moment and talk about using the space command. You've probably used it like to manage these components that you see here, whether it's software channels, systems, things like that. The one thing, though, that a lot of people don't realize is you can use the System Set Manager at the command line. And so when I use the term System Set Manager, does that mean anything to anyone? Okay. So Craig, you use the System Set Manager?
Occasionally.
Okay, yeah. So for those of you that are not familiar, let me just show you. When I go to Systems here, okay, if you look up here, there's 0 systems in my System Set Manager. So I'm going to come in, and let's say I want to work on this system, and I want to work on this system. Okay. Notice I now have 2 systems in the System Set Manager, so I can come in here, And now like I could just come in and I could say reboot those two systems, okay? So if I had like a bunch of systems just randomly, I select and put them in the System Set Manager, patch them, reboot them, whatever I need to do, okay? You can use that same System Set Manager at the command line, and I can tell you, this has saved me a lot of scripting on here. So for example, most organizations have a naming convention for their servers, okay? It might not be as simple as all dev servers start with dev, but in this case we'll say it does, right? So if I do space command, SSM_add dev, that will add all dev systems to the system set at that point, okay? Now that I have that, I can now target those. So I would do SSM list, and now I see my dev systems in there. And now, when I run a space command, in this case, I'm going to add child channels. My target is now SSM. And that, by doing that, all of those servers in the list now get plugged in there. And in this case, I'm adding a child channel called apps to all of my systems, okay? So, with those two patching strategies, I had one customer that we went out and we built the one patching lifecycle strategy, and they thought it was really cool until one of their other teams came back and said, that doesn't work for us. You got to redo it. So then we rebuilt it to the other strategy, the other patching structure, which was great, other than we now had 2,000 systems that no longer had any software repositories, right? Because we were yanking them away and creating new ones. So by going through using their naming convention, we added System Set Manager, added those systems. So now, instead of having to write a whole bunch of for loops and things, it was just a couple of commands to add those new channels to those systems. It made it a lot easier, okay? Now, the other thing to understand about System Set Manager is it does keep a record of it. So I would recommend anytime you use it, as soon as you're done with it, you need to remove it with the same expression that you added it with, okay? And then that will clean it up and basically set it back to 0, as you saw. There's a whole bunch we could do with space command, but that's for our time and scope of this session. That's one of the things I've seen that can really help you out, is using that. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about SALT. We're going to talk about using it at the command line as well as using the SALT API. When we look at the command line, these are the command lines that that ship with SALT. And if we look at where they're located, we see that most of those are on the SALT master, right? SALT call is just for the minion so that we can call it locally and not have to, if we're already logged into that system. Why would we want to use this? Well, let me show you some examples here. So when we look at a system, when we register to SUSE Manager, it's going to show up under here, and we'll accept its key or reject it if we need to. But that system will show up in here. And usually when we're doing implementations and consulting is going on site, a customer might say, hey, you know what, we want to bring in like, I've had anywhere from like hundreds to thousands of systems, okay? Well, I don't want to have to go in and click accept 1,000 times on there, right? So what I can do is go to the command line, and I can do SALT key, okay? And anything that was unaccepted would be listed there. So when I'm doing, we're bringing in new systems because it's a new SUSE Manager implementation, I might see 1,000 systems under unaccepted. Okay, so that fix is I just do SALT key -A. SALT command line convention is any lowercase argument means an individual system. Any uppercase means more than one. Okay, so if I ran that on there and I had a list of keys, it would come up and say, hey, do you want to accept these keys? I could say yes, and now it would accept all those keys, and that saves me a lot of time. Okay. If I was scripting it, I just have to add that -y so I don't get prompted.
There's a way to turn it on so it accepts anything.
So yes, that was, I'm glad you brought that up.
I've never typed that.
So you can set in your master configuration, you can set that up so that you have auto accept set to true, and then it will auto accept the keys. Now, just so you know, I have run into a couple of issues with that because there are some things that are looking for specific events. So, for example, a new key acceptance event. And so you might, depending on the implementation, you might want to just be aware of that if things don't seem like they're working the way you'd expect. Okay? All right. When we're in SUSE Manager, before we go to the command line, let's talk about how we'd send commands. So there's two ways to send a command to a system. So here I've got two systems here, and I could come in and select remote commands right here, and then I could put in the command that I want to send. Okay, so let's say maybe I did something like cat etc hosts, for example, right? And then I would schedule that command. Okay, so that would work, and that works well. Does anyone know? Let me ask this: how do I? If I sent this, if I had 50 systems in my system set manager, how do I view the output of those 50 systems? It's not that easy. I have to do it one at a time, okay? Exactly. So now what I'd have to do is I would have to come in to each one of those systems, and I'd come here, and I'd go advance, okay, and then I'd go history, and then I'd have to find the right one in there that I want, okay? So that, but it does work, and sometimes scheduling it, especially if maybe you're going to schedule the command to run late at night, it works great, right? And the system won't receive it until you've scheduled it for your maintenance window. The other way to do it, so that would actually put it under schedule when you do it that way. So that would be under, that would be under schedules or schedule here.
You can see which one's completed, which one's ready.
Exactly. So, yes. Yep. So you can see it. You'd see it under there too. The other thing is you've got remote commands under here. So let's say we do that same command. So let's do cat etc hosts. Okay. The first thing it's going to do is say find targets. Now notice in here I've put star, so that's going to find all my systems. Okay. And then now it says, okay, now I'm going to run the command. Okay. And so now I can look at each one of those just on one page. Okay. So that's going to that works well if you're just going to be running things ad hoc. Now sometimes we might want to be a little more specific in there. So because this interface lets me do a glob match on the name of the system by its minion ID. Sometimes I need to be a little more specific. So for example, if I do salt, and let's just do grains.items in here, okay? So if you're not familiar with salt grains, they're basically system properties. Think of them that way. So when a system starts up, salt goes and does an inventory. And so, for example, it grabs the OS release, right, or the OS code name. It gets the number of CPUs. All of that gets put in grains, right? Well, now what I can do, let's do this. All right, I guess I'm going to have to type it. So now what I'm going to do is salt can do what's called a compound match. And so now I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say a grain that's set to OS finger of /12 and a grain of OS release set to 12.3. And I want to do a status load average on there. Okay? So now I was able to take those grains, and the -C is a compound match. And like I said, I could do grains, I could do pillar and grains mixed, So let's do this. I'll just pick a pillar on one of these. So if I was going to do pillar, I could say select 12 boxes that have a pillar of org ID set to 1. And that's the first organization in there. Okay? So that going to the command line gives me a lot more flexibility. I can also set my own grains here. So I might come in and let's say come in and let's say anything. I'll just keep it simple. Grains.setVal. And let's do a DC for data center. And we'll say these ones are in the east. Okay. All right, so now I can do a salt and I can match on that and say anything that has a DC grain in the east, let's do a status.uptime. Okay. And if I were to do a okay, so notice that my build server right now doesn't have a DC grain, but the others do, and I'm able to target. So now I can, it's almost like a dynamic tagging on here. Now, when I do that grains.setVal, that does make it persistent, so that is available after a reboot. It actually writes it to an Etsy salt grains file for me. Okay. All right, let's jump in. So that's what we're talking about with the command line. And by the way, you see the command.run, by far the most abused function in Salt, right? Because we already know the Linux command, right? We just need to send it to all multiple systems. So if there's ever a module that gets blacklisted that people don't want run, it's probably command.run, just because it opens Pandora's box for everyone. All right, so that's what we talked about. Now, I do want to talk about, excuse me, the RESTful API. When in a SUSE Manager Salt implementation, SUSE Manager is talking to the Salt master through this API. Okay, and so when we look at our SUSEManager.conf in the Etsy saltmaster.d directory, it defines the API server. And so you see that we have this Rust Cherry Pie module, and that's what the web service for Salt is going to be listening on. So SUSE Manager tells it to listen on port 9080. Okay, and notice that it's listening on localhost, but notice also disable SSL is set to true. Okay. Now, that does make things run faster by not having SSL, but it's only listening on localhost. So I bring that up because if you ever change that to say, I want to remotely call that REST API, just know that you probably want to turn SSL on, okay, and generate some certificates for that. Okay. Now, when you turn on the API, the RESTful API, it requires authentication. So you have to configure external authentication. And this is how SUSE Manager ships with the authentication. So you'll have this admin user that will be used for authentication. If you modify that, like I said, you got to be very careful because that's how SUSE Manager is talking to Salt. So you could break SUSE Manager if you do it wrong. So make sure you back it up before you change anything on there. But you do need to restart the API service, which will reopen port 9080 for you. And then now you can call it. Now, if you're on the SUSE Manager box itself, you can call it locally as well without changing the configuration. Rather than getting into different programming languages, I just wanted to show you some simple examples of using curl commands to talk to the API. And sometimes I even use this just for troubleshooting if there's any problems with SUSE Manager, where I might schedule a job in SUSE Manager, but for some reason systems aren't getting it. Well, is SUSE Manager able to talk to SALT through this API? So here's an example of doing a login. Okay, so I just go to that port. Imagine the port not being 8000 and being 9080. I just realized that's incorrect. But I do login. Notice in this case, I am changing the header to a YAML header, but then I pass in those arguments, okay? And then that's what gets returned. Now, from that point on, now if I wanted to make a request, so let's say I do a test.ping, okay? So that's the same thing as doing this. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is pass that token that was returned in the output. I pass that in here. The local client, that is SALT. So anytime you see local client, it's local to the SALT master. Okay, that's what the SALT command is. It's the local client to the master. So client is local. I target star, and then I tell it the function I want to run. Okay. Now, if I don't want to have to keep passing that token, especially if I'm scripting this, then I can tell it to write that token to a cookies file. Okay, and so now that will be written, and so now all I have to do is any call after that will be a -b for the cookies, and it will just read that. Okay, so in this case, remember you saw me do a grains.items on there to list all that. So here I'm saying return that in YAML format. That's the SALT client, and this is to web server 1 to return its grains. Okay. Now, if I don't put that header in there, then it returns it in a Python dictionary format, or technically it's serialized JSON because it's going across the web interface. But if I wanted it in more YAML, because that's what I'm used to at the command line, that's why I changed that header. Okay. Here's how I can apply states through the API, right? So now I've come in here, I've specified the cookies, YAML local client. Notice I'm targeting minion 1, state.sls or state.apply, either one works, and I'm applying my Apache state. Now notice on here, I can even pass arguments, okay? So I've got argument of the state, and then I've got test equals true. So that's going to do a dry run of it. So it's not actually going to run it, right? It's going to do a dry run of that state and then return any possible errors. By leaving that last argument off, here's how I would actually apply that state for that system. Okay. There are some registers or URIs with the web service or webhooks. So for example, if I go /minions, it will automatically list, it will return all minions and all the grains of every minion, okay, by just going there. Now, if I just want one minion, then I go minions and then the name of the minions. So that's what we mean by like this being a restful API, is that it's just the host, minions is registered, and then the name of the minions, and then that returns it. I don't even have to make a function call like I did on the other ones, okay? I've seen a lot of times where people do something like this, and they can write their own web dashboards. For example, maybe they already have some type of dashboard for their IT department, and then that just pulls it in. Something simple like that. There's that one. I thought. Here's looking at keys. So remember we ran salt key at the command line. All I have to do is go /keys, and I can look at those keys or the keys of a specific minion. Now, just so you know, as far as security, that's just the public key. So it won't dump the private key on there. Same thing with jobs. I go /jobs. It's going to dump all the jobs from the job cache. Does anyone remember how long the default job cache keeps jobs for? What? 1 day, exactly. 24 hours on there. So you can change that, but it would dump the jobs the last 24 hours. So if there was an error last night maybe during some things we scheduled, we could look at dump the jobs and look at that. And I believe you can also do jobs / and the job ID, and you would just look at the specific job. And of course, log out. You saw the first one I did was log in. When I passed the user credentials, there's my log out. And these are the list of the webhooks or URIs for the SALT RESTful API that you can use. So those are some of the things that we use in consulting to try to automate and to stabilize environments using SALT and SUSE Manager. Kind of demoed along the way, unless someone has something specific they want to see, or otherwise I'll just open it up for questions. All right. Well, if there's no questions, then I'll let you get a few minutes back for your day. So anyway, thanks for attending. Appreciate it.